Story 1. 7 Rules of Survival in Apartment Number 12. It was a humid August day, the air thick with the heavy scent of summer. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows on the street as I returned home from work. The city was unusually quiet, as if everyone had retreated from the heat. I opened the door to my third-floor apartment in the old residential building where I had lived since childhood. The interior was pleasantly cool, thanks to the thick walls that effectively kept the heat outside. I tossed my bag onto the couch and turned on the fan, which began to hum softly, providing relief in the stuffy air. I had barely a moment to sit down and relax when the phone rang. Jerry's name appeared on the screen, my childhood friend with whom I hadn't been in contact for years. I answered instinctively. "Hello?" I answered uncertainly, wondering what could have prompted him to call right now. "Hi, Harry. It's Jerry. It's been a long time." There was something unsettling in his voice, something that made my heart beat faster. "Hey, Jerry. Is something wrong?" I asked, trying to hide my surprise. "This isn't a conversation for the phone. Do you have time to meet?" We agreed to meet at my apartment at 10:45 p.m. That evening, as the sun began to set, I heard a knock at the door. It was Jerry. He looked different from how I remembered, pale, with something disturbing in his movements. I opened the door and let him in. We sat at the table, and I let him speak. "Harry, I have to tell you something. Something that has been haunting me since that time," he began, his voice trembling. "Do you remember the rules of apartment number 12? I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and my heart started to race. Jerry's words brought back memories from our childhood, the first time I saw him. We were 14 when it happened. Jerry lived on the lowest floor, where the bricked-up apartment number 12 was located. It was at the very end of a long corridor, with no other apartments nearby. Apartment number 11 was much earlier, closer to the beginning of the corridor, and apartment number 13 was only on the next floor. There was no other apartment above the bricked-up apartment number 12. My parents forbade me from approaching that apartment. I never understood why until that day. That evening, the sky began to darken faster than usual. Clouds gathered on the horizon, and there was tension in the air. In the distance, I heard thunder heralding an approaching storm. I had arranged to spend the night at Jerry's place, who lived 2 floors below in the small residential block. I headed for the staircase. I began to descend the stairs, but at the very bottom, I noticed a figure. I descended further. That's when I saw him for the first time, a man with a cigarette. I quickly passed him. Only after passing him was I able to take a closer look. He was standing on the staircase, his face pale, his eyes deep-set, staring at me, or so it seemed. After a moment, he moved toward me. I quickened my pace, but before I realized it, he was already behind me. I feared what he might do, but he passed me, heading toward the door marked number 12. I watched as he approached the bricked-up apartment. Then something happened that I will never forget. The man with the cigarette stopped right in front of the door. Slowly, he reached for the handle. My eyes widened in fear and disbelief. The concrete wall vanished as if it had never been there. The man casually walked inside and closed the door behind him. A moment later, Jerry saw me through the peephole and invited me in. I didn't immediately tell him what I had witnessed. It wasn't until several minutes later, when we were alone in his room, that I recounted the incident with the mysterious man. He didn't hide his excitement and suggested that we go there the next day, knowing that his parents wouldn't allow us to go anywhere so late. We agreed on 3 p.m. the following day. In the morning, we had breakfast, and I left his apartment, my mind preoccupied with thoughts of the mysterious man with the cigarette and apartment number 12. As the appointed hour approached, my heart began to race. I entered the staircase, and the atmosphere was strangely tense. When I reached the bottom, I saw Jerry waiting for me. Together, we cautiously approached the apartment. Jerry reached for the handle, but all we saw was a concrete wall. The apartment was bricked up. Jerry accused me of lying, his excitement turning to anger. Suddenly, he stopped, standing still and staring at something behind me. I immediately turned around. There he was. The man with the cigarette stood right behind us, staring straight at the door of apartment number 12. I had never seen him blink. Suddenly, without taking his eyes off the door, he pulled something from his coat, a rolled-up piece of paper, which he extended toward me. Hesitantly, I took it from his hand, and almost immediately, he turned and walked toward the staircase. I stood there, stunned, as the man with the cigarette handed me the paper and silently walked away. Jerry, noticing my inaction, suddenly snatched the paper from me and began to read it. Only when Jerry grabbed the paper and started analyzing its contents did I join him. The contents were handwritten, but it was clear that it had been written in a hurry. The letters were uneven, sometimes crooked, as if the writer's hands were trembling, trying to keep up with their thoughts. Some words were barely legible, smudged by the quick movement of the pen. The content of the note read as follows. Rules of apartment number 12, remember, before you decide to explore apartment number 12, think twice. Rule 1, you can only enter the apartment between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. This is the only known way to access this apartment. Rule 2, when the clock strikes 3 a.m., you will have 5 minutes to leave the apartment. If you don't, you will notice that where the door should be, there is only a concrete wall. You will be trapped. If this happens, follow Rule 3. Rule 3, if you are trapped in apartment number 12, know that your chances of survival are slim. After a moment, you will hear wailing coming from the bedroom, growing louder with each passing second. Hide as quickly as possible and pray that it doesn't find you. You will be able to leave the apartment again at 11 p.m. Rule 4, between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., you can move freely around the apartment. However, remember that if you enter any room other than the one with the exit, always close the door behind you after leaving that room. Do not re-enter that room. If you do not follow this rule, you will soon hear a quiet wailing, and the apartment's exit door will slowly begin to close. Run to the exit as fast as you can, there might still be hope. Rule 5, in 1967, a woman with long black hair named Isabella was brutally murdered in the bedroom of this apartment. She was skinned and cut into pieces. After this incident, no one wanted to live in the apartment, and the building authorities decided to brick it up. However, for reasons unknown to me, the apartment can be accessed during the previously mentioned hours. So remember, if you hear quiet wailing, know that it's Isabella. Don't look at her, don't turn around, she hates being watched, hates being judged. Rule 6, don't scream, it will only hasten your painful death. Rule 7, never turn on light-emitting objects between 11:59 p.m. and 3 a.m. She is drawn to light. After reading the rules, Jerry couldn't hide his excitement. His eyes sparkled, and a smile betrayed his growing adrenaline. We have to go there, he said firmly. We agreed to go to the apartment at 11 p.m. We told our parents that we were spending the night at our friend Ben's place on the second floor to study for an important math exam. They didn't mind, as it wasn't the first time we had stayed at Ben's. When the night came, the clock read 10:55 p.m., and with hearts pounding, we tried to sneak out of Ben's apartment. Unfortunately, our footsteps woke him from his sleep. Groggy and confused, he asked where we were going. We told him about apartment number 12 and the rules written on the note. Ben frowned as he read the hastily written list of rules, then burst out laughing, unable to believe our story. But Jerry insisted, urging him to come with us and see for himself. I don't believe you, but it wouldn't hurt to check, he finally said, visibly intrigued. I'm going with you. Jerry nodded in agreement. The darkness of the night enveloped us, and excitement and tension grew with every step that brought us closer to apartment number 12. As we stood in front of the apartment, we made sure the corridor was empty, then Jerry reached for the door handle. The door opened with a quiet creak, and we held our breath, ready to see what we remembered, a solid, concrete wall that seemed to be the end of our journey. But as the door opened fully, we stood in shock. Instead of the cold, concrete wall that we both so clearly remembered, we saw an ordinary room. The room was dark but fully accessible, as if there had never been any obstacle there. This is impossible," Ben whispered, his confidence dissolving into the air. I stepped closer, hardly believing my own eyes. Jerry stood beside me, just as confused as I was, his hands still resting on the handle. Finally, we snapped out of it and entered the apartment, closing the door behind us. All three of us took out our flashlights after entering the apartment. The first thing that caught our eye after turning them on was the damage. The walls were covered with a thick layer of mold, its dark stains spreading along the rotten surfaces. In some places, the plaster had completely fallen off, revealing the raw brick underneath, and some areas were literally eaten away by moisture. For a moment, I thought I could smell the sickly sweet odor of rotting wood and fungus, which made me nauseous. The windows, barely visible through the semi-darkness, were completely bricked up from the outside. The curtains, which might have once been decorative, were now just shreds, dirty, decayed, and so fragile they could disintegrate at the slightest touch. The furniture in the room was scattered haphazardly. Old armchairs and sofas were caked with dirt, their upholstery consumed by moisture. Trash and shards of glass, which might have once been part of windows or mirrors, were strewn across the floor. Sinister moisture stains hung from the ceiling. In one corner, I noticed the remains of an old, broken chandelier, hanging miserably from a single, creaking chain. Every breath was a struggle, the air in the apartment was heavy, filled with dust and dampness. Yet in all this decay, one thing was most unsettling, the feeling that, despite looking abandoned for decades, the apartment had something in it that made me feel watched. We hesitantly explored what was once a living space until, finally, as we approached the door leading to the bedroom, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Jerry looked at me, his face pale and his eyes filled with fear. I felt that something terrible awaited us behind those doors, something we could not even begin to imagine. The smell of rotting meat hung in the air, making me feel sick and only intensifying the sense of unease. The door creaked open, and we stood in the doorway. What we saw exceeded our worst nightmares. The bedroom looked like a scene from a macabre film. The walls were covered in bizarre, chaotic drawings made with blood and something that resembled dried shreds of flesh. In the middle of the room stood an old, decayed bed, its mattress torn and soaked with blood, which had dried over time, forming dark, sticky stains. On the bed lay something we initially took for old, tattered rags. Only after a moment did we realize it was a person. The body was in a state of decomposition, barely holding together. It was scarred, and in some places, its limbs were cut off. Its eyes, empty and lifeless, seemed to be staring straight at us. Then I realized who I was looking at. I was looking at Isabella. I ran out of the room as fast as I could. The sight of the decaying body made my heart pound wildly, and my stomach churned. I felt an uncontrollable shiver run through my entire body. Jerry reacted second. He turned abruptly and, almost losing his balance, ran out of the bedroom. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide with fear. Before we reached the front door, I felt I could no longer hold back my nausea. I stopped, doubled over, and vomited onto the floor. My body trembled. I also noticed that, for some inexplicable reason, the apartment door was open. Moments later, Ben ran out of the bedroom, asking what the hell that was. I didn't listen because I realized something that froze the blood in my veins. Ben hadn't closed the bedroom door behind him. Then I heard it. A faint, almost inaudible wail coming from inside the bedroom. The sound was like a moan, slow, full of suffering. Jerry and Ben lifted their heads and looked toward the open bedroom door. I wanted to do the same, but I remembered the rules, the fifth rule. At the same moment, my friends turned their gaze toward the bed. The wailing grew louder, turning into a cry of despair, and I felt pure survival instinct take over. I didn't wait a second longer. I ignored everything. I didn't care what Jerry and Ben were doing, or even if they were running after me. I thought of only one thing: run. I sprang to my feet, leaping over broken furniture and piles of trash. I ran blindly, barely noticing what was in front of me. My heart pounded like a hammer, and my head throbbed with adrenaline. Every step, every stumble in this abandoned, rotten apartment only spurred me to even greater effort. Suddenly, I noticed the door leading to the corridor slowly starting to close. My heart stopped. I knew that if those doors slammed shut, we would be trapped in this cursed apartment, and the hope of escape might disappear forever. Jerry ran beside me, his breathing heavy, his movements full of panic. My heart beat in quick, almost terrifying coordination. Just as the door slammed shut with a loud bang, Jerry and I were already in the corridor. We tumbled out of the apartment, falling to the ground, trying to catch our breath. With a mixture of terror and relief, I looked at Jerry. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, a cold shiver ran through me as I realized that Ben was still inside. I suddenly collapsed, struggling to stand, but my legs would no longer obey me. I fainted, collapsing onto the cold, dirty corridor floor. I swear, in the moment I fell, I saw him. A man with a cigarette stood at the end of the corridor, smiling at me mockingly. After those events, we decided to remain silent. It was a decision that came hard to us, but we considered it the only possible one. Ben's disappearance was reported, but he was never found. He vanished without a trace. But I still remember. I remember the mocking smile of the man with the cigarette, and that awful moan that haunts me in my nightmares to this day. And though years have passed, I still can't forget what happened to Ben, and I still feel the weight of the fact that he was never found. After Jerry and I finished school, our paths diverged, and I never saw my friend again. Until that evening. Do you remember that horrible evening? That night changed our entire lives, especially mine when I looked into the bedroom that night, and I saw that. What did you see? I asked, worried. I saw Isabella. Her corpse slowly stood up on what used to be legs, and she let out that moan. I saw her grab Ben by the ankles and slowly drag him into the bedroom. I heard his screams, and then the sound of bones breaking. I know that your nightmare probably ended that day, but mine only began. Since then, I hear her at night, I hear her whispers, and they're accompanied by the smell of rotting meat. I was probably the only person who didn't think he was crazy. I was there with him, I saw all those things, and I heard that awful moan. In 5 minutes, it'll be 11 p.m. I'm going to that apartment. I can't take it anymore, I have to end this. It dawned on me that I was most likely seeing Jerry for the last time. I watched as he slowly got up from the table and left the apartment. Story 2. I keep finding duplicates of things in my apartment. This is going to sound completely insane. I've been sitting on my phone for the past few hours trying to decide if I should even share this. The idea of it is so absurd I can barely wrap my head around it. But, if anything, I need to have some record of this experience if things take a turn for the worst. And they're starting to look pretty bad. It all started about a month ago. For some context, I live with my roommate in a small flat in Washington, D.C. I'm not home a whole lot because my job requires me to work upwards of 70 hours a week. I came home one night after a harrowing day of work. It was pretty late and, I thought, my roommate was already in bed. I was fully prepared to do my nightly routine and hop right into bed. I unlocked the door to my apartment, set my keys on the kitchen counter and opened the fridge to scarf down some leftovers from the day prior. I turned my back from the kitchen counter for not even a minute as I rummaged through the fridge, scouring each shelf for my Tupperware container of taco meat. Upon finally finding it, I turned back around to head towards the microwave and heat it up. But something caught my eye. There were now 2 sets of keys on the kitchen counter. No, that's not right, I thought to myself. I knew I had just put my keys on the empty kitchen counter. So how could another set have magically appeared? Was I so tired I was seeing double? I rubbed my eyes, but the replica keys remained, still next to mine, clear as day. I tried to rationalize it immediately. I'm a logical guy. I can always find an explanation for even the most absurd phenomena. I knew I didn't have any spare keys, despite my mother's constant insistence that I made copies just in case. So how could another keychain, identical to the one I own nonetheless, materialize next to mine in an instant? I figured my roommate had crept in behind me and placed his keys on the table next to mine. I was probably so exhausted I hadn't even heard him come in. Though this explanation made the most amount of sense, upon further inspection, I realized the keys were an exact replica of mine. Right down to the Charmander keychain I had since I was a teenager. There were keys on this mysterious replica that I knew for a fact my roommate couldn't have had. For instance, I saw keys to offices in the building I worked at. The keys were even positioned the same way I had set them down. It looked as if someone had copied the exact placement of my keys and pasted it directly beside them on the counter. It was utterly impossible. But again, I insist that I was not an irrational man. Not then, at least. I knew this had to be some kind of prank. My roommate and I weren't close. He was a pretty peculiar guy with interests that differed from mine. We didn't interact much besides the occasional cordial greeting. But I never would have expected him to be smart enough to play a prank like this. It was odd. Even for him. I continued to reason away, coming up with any plausible explanation for the duplication of my keys as I ate my dinner in silence and headed to bed. But I couldn't sleep that night. I tossed and turned and sweat through my sheets. I had known in my gut something wasn't right. But I had ignored it, for the sake of my own sanity. The next morning, the cloned keys were gone. Only one pair remained on the kitchen counter. I breathed a sigh of relief, chalking it up to me being so sleep-deprived that I was imagining things. Boy, was I wrong. After about 2 weeks, I had honestly almost completely forgotten about the whole incident. That was, until it happened again. This time, I had just gotten out of the shower on my one day off. It was Saturday and I had decided to go for a quick run around the city for some exercise. I had arrived back at my apartment and taken my AirPods out to jump in the shower. I placed them on my dresser without a second thought before gravitating towards the bathroom to do my thing. About 15 minutes later, I leisurely made my way out of the bathroom, heading towards my dresser to throw on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt when I saw it. 2 AirPod cases lay before me. One right where I had left it, and a duplicate right beside it. I had to bite back a scream. Where had the other case come from? How could I even discern the difference between the two? Which one belonged to me? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the scene before me in disbelief. I even contemplated whether or not I was going cross-eyed. I imagined the horror of beginning to see double of singular objects. I eventually, tentatively, reached a hand out to touch one of the cases to prove this theory. But I felt it in my hand. I felt them both in my hands. At the same time. That was when I decided something was seriously wrong. Now, what I did next I can't provide an explanation for. I'm not sure what came over me. Perhaps it was sheer curiosity. Whatever it was a mistake. I had scrambled over to my bed, tearing away at the sheets and the comforter, to find my phone and ran back to the AirPod cases. I picked one of the cases up. At this point, I wasn't sure if I was picking up the duplicate or the original, but, in hindsight, I'm assuming it was the duplicate. I stared at my phone and saw they were connected to the AirPods. I pressed play on a song I was all too familiar with, Kelly Clarkson. The music I heard coming from these AirPods, if you could even call it music, was not Kelly Clarkson's, Since You've Been Gone. No, this was what I can only describe as the most demonic sounds I had ever heard in my life. It was a chorus of screams, women, children, monstrous creatures wailing in agony and at a volume so loud, I thought my eardrums had burst. It was similar to what I had imagined the depths of hell to sound like. I nearly smacked myself outside of the head trying to rip the AirPods out of my ears. I felt all the blood leave my body as my knees buckled beneath me. I couldn't move, I couldn't react, I couldn't even scream. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I was beginning to believe it was otherworldly. My sanity had fled me in a mere instant, and I had no idea what to do next. That evening, I contemplated checking myself into a mental hospital. The replica doppelganger AirPods had disappeared, but I had started to notice the clones of my belongings appearing more frequently. That same day, I had found two of the same ferns growing by my beside window when I knew I had only bought one. I tried to pour myself a glass of bourbon to calm my nerves and found two of the same limited edition Blood Oath Kentucky straight bourbon bottles right beside each other. I had gotten only one as a gift on my 25th birthday. I even went to brush my teeth that night and found a replica of my same exact toothbrush, right down to the division of the bristles and the directions they were pointing in. I called out of work the next day and the following days after that. I couldn't function. I was living a life of dread, of trepidation. I was afraid to open my eyes. I was afraid to fall asleep. I felt as if I were going insane. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened tonight. I was holed up in the corner of my room sitting at my desk making a list of things that had duplicated themselves only to disappear in an instant. Throughout the course of the week, I had my laptop, my dresser, my picture frames, my pillows, and even my window duplicate themselves on more than one occasion. It had gotten to the point of being nearly inconvenient if not inconceivably terrifying, specifically when my dresser had cloned itself right in front of the doorway to my bathroom. I hadn't had any contact with the outside world since the AirPod incident. Hadn't seen or spoken to a human being in fear of them seeing through my veiled mental deterioration. I hadn't eaten or slept. I knew I would die if I kept living like this. At one point, I heard the front door of my apartment swing open followed by the muffled humming of my roommate as he made his way to his room. I knew he was my only chance at survival. He was the only other person I could cling to, that I could use as some token of normalcy. Someone to keep me grounded. I ran to my bedroom door and flung it open. I raced to the kitchen and caught him just before he had laid a hand on his bedroom door. I was panting like a marathon runner, and probably sweating like one too, but I didn't care. I didn't care about my appearance anymore, about how crazy I looked or about how crazy I was about to sound to him. I just needed someone to confide in. "Hey, man. What's going on?" he said casually as he turned his attention to my hunched-over form. His tone immediately changed from cordial to genuinely concerned. "Whoa, you okay?" I gasped, struggling to get the words out. "I have to talk to you about something. Something that's been going on here." Whoa. All right. Take it easy, man. Let's sit down for a second." He had put his hands in front of him gently and was talking to me as if he were trying to coax a rabid animal. I remember thinking his calm, cool tone was particularly out of character given that, as I mentioned before, my roommate was a pretty odd guy and wasn't usually one to be great with social interactions. But, at that moment in time, his level of emotional intelligence was of very little concern to me. "You have to listen to me," I tried to say, swallowing the saliva that had accumulated in my mouth. "There's something really wrong with this place. I keep seeing double." "Seeing double? Like you're too fucked up or something? Is that what you mean?" He stifled a laugh, clearly an attempt to lighten the mood, but I persisted. No. I'm not drunk. I keep seeing things appear. Objects that are duplicating themselves." I knew how it sounded. I knew there was very little chance he would believe me, but I didn't care. I needed to find a solution. I needed to talk to someone about this. Anyone. "Dude, that's impossible." My roommate chuckled nervously. "Are you sure you're not just having some eye problems or something?" No. You're not listening to me." I was growing more and more agitated by the second. "I can feel them, too. The replicated objects. They're physically there. You have to understand." Suddenly. So suddenly, I saw something from behind my roommate. From behind his form. I saw movement. I know I did. I saw a figure. It was peeking at me from inside of his open bedroom door. Though it was dark, the only source of light coming from the kitchen and it barely illuminated my roommate let alone the area behind his large body, I saw it. I saw the glimmer of a black eye peeking at me from beyond him. It disappeared just as quickly as it appeared, as if it were snatched back into his room by an unseen force. I stared at my roommate with wild eyes. I pointed a shaky finger at him, ever so slowly. "Who are you?" I say, in a voice so low I almost didn't recognize it as my own. My roommate's face morphed from a concerned expression into one of sheer terror. What do you mean, man?" Silence rang in the air and the tension was sharp enough to cut through steel. I stared at my roommate for God knows how long before I glanced once more at the doorway behind him just as the figure reappeared. I could only see half of its face, a dark, black eye, the corners of a mouth, and a long slim nose. I couldn't see a discernible expression, but I knew in my gut that I could see just enough to recognize those features, the too long nose, the high cheekbones, the shaggy, greasy hair. I knew it was him. Or one of him, at least. It was my roommate. All I had to see after that was the movement of its mouth as it formed one word. Run. And that's just about what did it for me. I bursted into action, bolting towards the door and nearly ripping it off of its hinges as I threw myself into the hallway of our dingy apartment building. I raced down the hallway, pushing through the emergency exit doors and sprinting through the streets of DC, narrowly avoiding getting hit by a slew of cars on my way out. Yet, the entire time I could still hear them, the footsteps behind me. I didn't bother turning around. I ran for what felt like miles before finally slowing to a halt near a dimly lit dive bar on the wrong side of town. I ended up walking in for a drink because, Jesus, after that night, wouldn't you? And that takes me to where I am now, sipping on a vodka soda, sitting here typing this all out, recounting the past few weeks that have been nothing but complete chaos. I was lucky enough to have had my phone in my back pocket when the whole situation with my roommate went down. I'm surprised it didn't fly out as I ran for my life down the streets of DC. I don't know what to do. I can't call the police. I'll sound like a complete lunatic. Regardless, I know what I saw. I know there's something seriously wrong. The only upside of this night is that during the time I took to write this out, someone must have noticed how troubled I looked and ordered me another vodka soda because now there are two sitting in front of me. Story 3. A night at my friend's house. I was at my friend's house, a typical suburban residence surrounded by trees that whispered with the night wind. It was a night like any other, but a subtle unease kept me awake. As I tossed and turned in bed, I felt my throat dry and decided I needed water. The house was steeped in silence, except for the soft snoring of my friend, who slept soundly in the next room. I crept downstairs, trying not to make any noise. The wooden floor creaked under my feet, and the darkness seemed to press down on me as I approached the kitchen. The faint moonlight partially lit the hallway, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. A sense of discomfort grew inside me, but I ignored it, attributing it to the interrupted sleep. I opened the fridge, feeling the cold light envelop me. I grabbed a pitcher of water and drank directly from it, hearing only the sound of the liquid going down my throat. I closed the fridge, and that's when I heard a faint click coming from the direction of the living room. I stopped, listening carefully, and realized someone was fiddling with the front door lock. Curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I approached the hallway that led to the front entrance. The silhouette of a woman stood out against the door, and my heart raced as I recognized the figure of my friend's mother. She had her back to me, focused on carefully locking the door, as if trying not to be heard. Shock froze me in place. I knew my friend's mother was out of town, he had told me that earlier. I started to back away, but the wood creaked under my weight, and she turned abruptly. Our eyes met for a brief moment, but something was wrong with her. Her eyes were empty, lifeless, as if she didn't really see me. She began walking toward me with a slow, dragging gait, as if being pulled by some invisible string. The air around me seemed to grow colder with each step she took. My legs trembled, but I managed to turn and run back to my friend's room. The door slammed shut behind me, and I shook my friend awake with all the strength I could muster. He woke up confused, rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" he mumbled, still groggy. I quickly told him what I had seen, trying not to sound crazy. When I mentioned his mother, he froze, his face instantly paling. "My mom isn't here." "She's miles away, visiting my aunt," he said, his voice trembling. The fear in his voice made me realize something was terribly wrong. He quickly got up and locked the bedroom door, placing a chair against it for reinforcement. We stayed silent, ears straining for any sound coming from the hallway. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by our heavy breathing. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The air in the room became oppressive, as if we were being watched. Finally, we heard soft footsteps in the hallway, slowly approaching the door. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. My friend grabbed his phone and started dialing frantically, but there was no signal. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Suddenly, the doorknob began to turn slowly, accompanied by a soft scratching on the wood. "Don't open it," I whispered, gripping my friend's arm. He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. The door trembled, as if someone was gently pushing, testing the chair's resistance. Then, everything stopped. The silence returned, but it was different now, denser, more threatening. The door didn't move anymore, and the sound of footsteps retreating echoed down the hallway. We were paralyzed, unsure if we should feel relieved or even more terrified. Time seemed to have stopped, each second stretching into an eternity of dread. My friend finally broke the silence. "This can't be happening," he whispered, as if trying to convince himself. But the truth was clear. Something was very wrong with this house. We decided we couldn't stay there any longer. We needed to leave, but the thought of facing whatever was out there was terrifying. We gathered our courage and decided to escape through the bedroom window. With difficulty, we opened the window and crawled out. The cold night air wrapped around us as we dropped onto the wet grass. We crouched for a moment, trying to listen for any signs of being followed. Everything was quiet, but the stillness only deepened our fear. We started running across the yard, heading for the street. The trees around us seemed taller and more menacing under the moonlight. When we reached the gate, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed behind us. We looked back and saw my friend's mother standing at the edge of the garden, watching us with those empty eyes. She didn't move, but something in her gaze made us speed up. We ran like never before, with the sound of our hearts pounding in our ears. We reached the deserted street and kept running until the house was far behind. Finally, we stopped, panting and cold with sweat, trying to process what had happened. We hid in a nearby playground, where we sat on a bench, still in shock. The silence of the night seemed to mock us. We tried calling my friend's parents again, but the phone still had no signal. Something was isolating us, trapping us in that endless night of terror. Time passed slowly, and the sky began to lighten with the first rays of sun. We felt a momentary relief, as if the light could dispel whatever that evil presence was. When we returned to the house, we found the front door slightly ajar, gently swinging with the morning breeze. My friend went in first, cautiously, and I followed. The house seemed normal, almost welcoming under the daylight. But the discomfort was still there, a shadow hanging over us. There was no sign of his mother, and everything was in its place as if nothing had happened. We decided to pack our things and leave immediately. While my friend was grabbing his clothes in the bedroom, I went to the kitchen. The water pitcher was exactly where I had left it, but next to it was a note. I picked up the piece of paper, feeling my heart race again. The scribbled words chilled me to the bone. "She always comes back when night falls." The note fell from my hand, and I ran back to the bedroom. My friend was standing at the door, staring fixedly at something on the floor. I followed his gaze and saw a red stain that hadn't been there before, slowly spreading across the carpet. We didn't need to say anything. We knew it wasn't safe to stay another minute in that house. We ran out, leaving everything behind. When we reached the street, one last look at the house revealed something that made my blood run cold. In the bedroom window, my friend's mother was standing, watching us with a sinister smile on her face. She slowly raised her hand and waved before disappearing into the darkness inside. That was the last time I saw my friend. He moved away with his father to another city, and we never talked about that night again. But to this day, when night falls and the house is quiet, I remember that smile, and I can't help but think that somewhere, she's still waiting for us. Story 4. I killed something that night. I'm a long-haul truck driver. I've been doing it for almost 15 years and have honestly enjoyed it. I've hauled everything from dried goods like cereal and macaroni to things like cell phones and computers. It's been a pretty well-paying career and I've honestly enjoyed it. However, there was this one night around 10 years ago. I was hauling office supplies such as pens and paper halfway across the country. I'd been driving for a pretty long time, but I had a deadline to beat. I remember it was getting pretty late, but my favorite podcast was keeping me company. I guess listening to guys argue about sports made me a little less lonesome. The road got that way sometimes. Luckily I had a beautiful fiancée waiting for me at home. But on that night, she would be the furthest thing from my mind. I remember cruising down a dark and desolate highway. Things like stores and houses were nowhere in sight. In moments like this, it felt as if I were the only person in the entire world. Although, I was about to be proven very wrong. Within my view, the road was clear and empty. Suddenly, something darted in front of my truck from out of nowhere. Of course, with such a big machine, I wasn't able to simply slam on brakes and stop. To my shock, I ended up hitting whatever ran out in front of me. It must have been big, as the entire 18-wheeler shook upon collision. I came to a stop as quick as I could, fearing the worst had happened. That a person most likely made the mistake of stepping in front of my rig. As I killed the engine, I took a minute before exiting the vehicle. After all, if I did hit someone, my life was going to be over. Getting married, having a few kids and watching them grow. Those things wouldn't happen with me sitting in a prison cell. But regardless, I had to check on who or whatever this was. Though I had my doubts, they survived a head-on collision with a mighty semi. Within my first few steps, I heard a small squelch sound. Upon looking down, I saw a pool of blood already starting to form. Not to mention the fact that my size 10 boot was already standing in it. That's when it hit me, this had to be a human. No animal would lose this amount of blood, it was hard to fathom. But I was positive I had just killed someone. Within a few steps, however, I would be proven wrong. Pinned under the front of my truck was not the body of a human being. Instead, it looked to be some sort of creature. Upon further investigation, I could clearly see that it was dead. As for what it was, I couldn't tell you. The thing was a beast, it had to be around 6 foot tall. Seemingly a canine-like creature with fangs protruding from its mouth. It could have been a large dog, but that didn't seem right. Even though it was stuck, I could clearly see its broad chest and shoulders, as well as 2 long and hairy legs, almost like a man's. The only thing I could compare it to would be that of a werewolf. Absolutely stumped and unsure of what to do, I called the police. While waiting around, I couldn't help but stare at this odd being. I'd never seen anything like it before, and now even a putrid smell emanated from its corpse. Like that of an animal that never bathed before. I'd be so glad when officers finally did arrive, maybe they could make some sense of this situation. I would soon be greeted by 2 older men giving me annoyed looks. I'm sure they had a long day and didn't care about some dead animal. But those thoughts would change as soon as they saw this thing. Both men's eyes grew wide and their skin pale. I heard one ask the other if this could be some guy in a costume. I watched as they tried to pull it out from under my truck. As they did, the smell from earlier became even worse. Though seeing that thing's entire body for the first time left us in awe. It was so big, the arms alone were thicker than some bodybuilders. As well as sharp claws that I was sure could rip us apart with ease. I'll never forget how the one man looked as he spoke into his walkie-talkie. He then approached me and shook his head before speaking. "Mister, we don't know what you hit. But we're gonna need somebody smarter than us to figure it out. Mind waiting by the car?" he asked. Now I did have a load to deliver, but it seemed best to comply. If I was being honest, it would be nice to figure out what was lying there. After another 20 minutes passed, a second vehicle arrived on the scene. Instead of your usual police cruiser, I saw a mysterious all-black car. A man would step out, wearing a sharp black suit to match. He looked down at the creature for only a brief moment before letting out a loud sigh. Without saying a word, he began to approach me. I'd be lying if I said the man wasn't intimidating. Something about the look in his eyes, it was cold and calculating. Like he walked through hell and came back unscathed. I remember he looked at me and spoke in a deep voice. "They've got a lot of cleanup to do here. Let's get to the station and talk about what you saw." Once again I didn't resist, I willingly went along with this strange man. He drove me to a nearby police station, where I was seated in an interrogation room. I was alone at first, but soon the man would return with 2 cups of coffee. He looked down while stirring his java and began talking. He told me that what I saw tonight was nothing more than an exotic pet. An endangered one that was actually very illegal to own. I couldn't help but giggle. I didn't believe what he said for a second. I told him that was a stretch, and that it looked more like a werewolf to me. He wasn't amused, as he slammed his hand on the table and shouted. He told me that there was no such thing as a werewolf. That I needed to realize that this wasn't a game. He pushed how this was an illegal pet and wanted me to agree with him. It was to the point that he said I could lose my job if I didn't comply. Without much of a choice, I assured him that what I hit was only a pet. Afterwards he asked for my shoes and even gave me a pat down. It was all so strange, I didn't understand why he was being such a jerk. In fact, I felt downright threatened by him. After a few minutes, he brought me a pair of cheap jailhouse shoes. He told me mine were ruined by the blood and that he threw them out. I was pretty upset, as those were an expensive pair of work boots. But it was pretty obvious I had no room to negotiate. He didn't let me finish my shipment either, saying my truck was totaled out. I knew this was a lie, the front end was only lightly damaged. I ended up receiving a bus ticket and went back home. I was off the road for 2 weeks without hearing a thing. Finally my boss would call and put me back to work. Weeks turned into months and then years. My fiancée and I got married and even had a little boy. I continued to drive 18-wheelers, never having another incident like that again. My life was mostly normal, but sometimes weird things would happen. I'd receive phone calls in the middle of the night asking if I'd seen anything strange. I would say no and try to identify the caller, but they always hung up. At times I would catch suspicious black vehicles following my rig while I was driving. Perhaps it was all just a coincidence and I prayed it was. Even so, I didn't believe what I hit that night was just a pet. As for its true identity, I'm sure it would forever remain a secret. If I'm being honest, maybe that was for the best.